right, Sarah, so it's week 2 in our Resurrected study, looking at 6 different people or groups of people that had an interaction with the resurrected Jesus in the 40 days from his resurrection to his ascension, right, to where he leaves this earth as we know it. And so week 2, famous one is Peter, right? And what's interesting is what Peter and some of the other followers did is they returned to their old way of living. Jesus disrupted their life for years, and he dies presumably to them, and they just go back to what they know, and that's fishing. Yeah. So we're at the Sea of Galilee. They're on a boat. They're fishing all night. They catch nothing, like no fish are caught all night. And I think that's God's grace, right? Like they go back to the thing they were before, and God's like, I'm not going to let you catch anything. It's not going to work out. They catch nothing. They're exhausted. I've never fished all night. I've never caught no fish all night or caught nothing all night. And so I don't know how it would feel. But then Jesus shows up in bodily form, but they don't know it's Jesus just yet. And he gives them the most ridiculous thing, which is, have you thought about putting the nets on the other side of the boat? And I don't know if they laughed at him. I don't know what they did. I would have probably not done it, but they did it. Yeah. And they caught so many fish. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's a callback to when Jesus calls them the first time, right? Yeah. And so it's so interesting how this parallels in a lot of different ways. Yeah. Yeah, and you will see that later on in the story here in a second. And the Bible is so rich. They catch 153 fish. I don't know. Exactly 153. I don't know how that happened. And they were talking about it was just enough to be a lot, and the nets stretched, but they didn't break. And at that moment, they see who Jesus really is when this miraculous thing happens yet again. And it says Peter throws on his overcoat, right? Yep. And he starts running in from 100 yards out again, so much detail, runs a football field through the shallow water into Jesus. And then my favorite part of the story is they eat the fish on the shore. He had made a fire. Jesus made a fire for them to eat. And it's one of those details we can miss, Sarah, but it's really important. Yeah. It shows Jesus' humanity. Yeah. He's alive. Yeah, this isn't ghost Jesus. Fish. This isn't ghost Jesus or, mysterious smoke Jesus. This is a literal Jesus eating fish and bread, it says, with them. And I can only imagine what the conversation looked like. And then it moves into the meat of our story, the big part of it, Sarah, where we see Peter in a series of 3 talk to Jesus. And it recalls back to 3 mistakes from just days earlier. And now it's 3 different ways Jesus speaks to him again. So take us into that part. Yeah, it's really interesting because I think when you first read this story, you're thinking, okay, Peter answered correctly the first time. Why is Jesus still asking him, do you love me? Do you love me? But he's making a point. And Peter in this moment knows exactly what Jesus is doing because Jesus has even set the scene of the exact fire and just like the visceral setup, of how he would have felt when he betrayed Jesus, right? So tell us about that. Yeah, how did Peter betray and deny Jesus 3 times? So Jesus foretold it at the Last Supper and said, hey, one of you is going to betray me. And Peter is adamant. He's saying, it's not going to be me, which is so interesting because I think that's us a lot of times, right? Like we don't think that we're capable of some of the things we end up doing. Oh, for sure. And it's so interesting how Peter, with that first denial, says no. And it's really, really quick. Yeah. Like he doesn't even hesitate to say, no, I don't know him. And then I feel like it escalates a little bit because even the text says that he denies him first time, just denying. The second time with an oath, the third time with curses. And so that's so true. So he says, I don't know him. I don't know him with an oath and then an oath plus a curse. Right. Okay, he covers all of the bad things to do. All of them, yeah. And it's interesting how it escalates every time because we were talking earlier about how sin does that to us too. Like the first time we go into sin, it might be a little uncomfortable, but then we get past that first barrier and then it gets easier and easier and easier. And so in this moment, like Peter knows that Jesus is calling back to when he betrayed him around that fire. So Jesus is back on the beach. The fire's going. There was a fire that night when he was killed or when he was on trial and he denied them. And then there's a fire in this morning where Jesus is sitting there, they're eating them. But tell us about the 3 things Jesus does the second time when they're on the beach. What's he say to them? Yeah, he reinstates them in just like a really beautiful way. And I think a lot of people kind of relate this passage to like a recommitment or rededication with Jesus, right? Because it's really interesting that he's calling him back to what he has called him to be originally. He's saying, hey, like, I want you to be more than just a fisherman. Like, I want you to feed my sheep and take care of my lambs. And it's kind of that same thing. Like, he's escalating the like recommitment to him every single time, just like the betrayal. Yeah, it's interesting. So what he says is, he says, Peter, do you love me? Yeah. And when Peter says, obviously, yes, I do.
Of course, yeah.
Every time what he's pushing the narrative is, okay, if you love me, what you're going to do is lead my ministry, feed my sheep.
Right.
You're going to be a leader. And he keeps pushing the envelope. And I think, why would he need that? Why would Peter need that from Jesus? Is because he knows he's denied him.
Right.
So maybe he feels disqualified.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I would feel that in that moment. And it's interesting, like we were talking about this earlier too, of he threw on his outer garment to go meet Jesus. And again, like we don't really know why, but kind of in my head, I was thinking he might feel some shame. Because think back to the Garden of Eden, like the first thing Adam and Eve did when they felt that shame was put on clothes. Right. And so it's interesting that he would put on that outer garment to go through water to meet Jesus, but he is just feeling all kinds of shame and feels disqualified in this moment. That's why he went back to fishing. Because he didn't know what else to do
the only
but
thing
to
he's
go
qualified
back.
for. And so if we were to get practical for a second, I think all too often we find ourselves caught in that situation where we've done something shameful and we feel disqualified to do the things of God now. And I think it's a reminder that so often that the thing that disqualifies us is really something fine that God uses later on, right? Like he'll shine his light upon us in a new way. And that thing that was once filled with darkness is now filled with light. And that becomes the light we share with others, is like, hey, I've been where you are and God has totally changed me. And that we're not too far gone, right? Like it doesn't get a whole lot worse than what Peter did.
Right. And nobody's too far gone. It's just like we talked about a few weeks ago with confession. Like the Lord can use like those deepest dark parts of our stories to bring others into the light and for his good. And so I think Peter is just like one of many examples of how the Lord can restore us from when we think we were too far gone. You know, nobody's too far gone. Like if he can restore Peter from his shame and his betrayal of Jesus, then he can restore me too.
He literally denied Jesus at the most vulnerable point, and did it aggressively and in terrible ways. And yet God goes, I'm going to build my church upon this, upon the faith that you have in me. And so yet again, we see where when someone encounters the resurrected Jesus, their faith is instilled. And so Peter saw him dead and sees him alive and then stakes his whole claim. And even in this little passage, we've not spent time on it, Jesus even instructs Peter that he's going to die. And it's very interesting that then Peter's willing to. And it's just yet again, more evidence that we can trust and that we can stake our lives on, that Jesus was dead and he's alive, and that makes everything he said true.